7 drivers who returned to F1 after serious injuries. Mika Hakkinen. In qualifying for the 1995 Australian Grand Prix at Adelaide, a puncture sent Hakkinen's McLaren across a curb and flying into the wall at over 120 miles an hour. He'd been knocked unconscious and suffered a skull fracture and minor brain injuries. Only an emergency tracheotomy performed trackside saved his life. After a long and difficult recovery and further surgery, he was able to be back in the car for testing ahead of the 1996 season, where he immediately showed he'd lost none of his speed. When Adrian Newey and McLaren got the 1998 regulations bang on, he was able to win the championship and then followed it up with another one the following year. Manuel Fangio. The great Fangio didn't get a chance to defend his maiden title in 1952 as rule changes put Alfa Romeo out of the sport and Fangio without a drive. He had a few runs in non-championship races though, and it was in one of these at Monza that he had a nasty accident which left him with a broken neck and out of racing for the rest of the year. He recovered in time for the 1953 season however and went on to finish an impressive second in the championship. He of course then went on to win the next 4 championships, an incredible achievement. Johnny Herbert. Johnny Herbert was on the way to being F1's next big talent after a massively successful junior career. However, his prospects appeared to have ended following a monster shunt in Formula 3000 in 1988, which left both his feet almost literally hanging on by a thread. After multiple operations, he found himself on the grid for the first Grand Prix of 1989 driving for Benetton. He was on crutches and had to be lifted into the car, but he finished an amazing 4th despite being in incredible pain. Although his form dropped off over the rest of the year as a result of his injuries, he went on to forge a successful career which included 2 wins for Benetton in 1995, another one for Stewart in 1999, and a famous Le Mans victory for Mazda in 1991. The injuries always had an effect on his ability though, and you have to wonder just how successful he could have been were it not for that accident. Graham Hill. Graham Hill's F1 career should have come to an end when he smashed both of his legs to pieces in the 1969 United States Grand Prix and ended up being confined to a wheelchair for months as a result. But Graham Hill was determined and wasn't ready to give up just yet, and was on the grid for the season-opening South African Grand Prix in 1970. He went on to finish 6th and had to be lifted from the car afterwards. Similarly to Herbert, he wasn't the driver he had been before the accident, and aside from a non-championship win at Silverstone in 1971, the best he could hope to achieve was the occasional points finish in attritional races. Niki Lauda. If you've watched Rush or are old enough, you're probably familiar with this story. Without a doubt, the most famous comeback of all time. Niki Lauda was burned so badly in his horrific Ferrari accident at the Nürburgring in 1976 that he wasn't expected to survive. Yet amazingly, just 6 weeks later, he was back in his Ferrari to resume his title battle with James Hunt. In his comeback race, he outqualified his Ferrari teammates and bravely finished an outstanding 4th, even though his bloody burns were still in bandages from the accident. He was still leading the championship heading to the final round in Fuji, but the race was so wet that he couldn't see properly as a result of his burns and withdrew from the race, which allowed Hunt to finish 3rd and win the title. He won the title the following year though, and after a brief retirement came back to win again in 1984, this time for McLaren. Not bad for someone who'd had a priest administer them their last rites. Felipe Massa. In qualifying for the 2009 Hungarian Grand Prix, Felipe Massa was struck by an errant spring from Rubens Barrichello's brawn, and many wondered if he'd survive. The impact knocked him unconscious, and the spring pierced his helmet, fracturing his skull and coming perilously close to blinding him. After being put in a coma and given emergency surgery, he began a road to recovery which included a metal plate being put in his head ahead of his return in 2010. Felipe Massa hasn't managed to win since the 2008 season finale. Well, there was the race in Hockenheim in 2010, but you know, Fernando was faster. Martin Brundle. Martin Brundle was rival to Ayrton Senna in British F3, and like Senna, he made his F1 debut in 1984. Brundle was driving for Tyrrell and finished an impressive 2nd in Detroit, but at the next race in Dallas, a qualifying crash into the unforgiving concrete blocks lining the circuit left him with broken feet and ankles. Brundle missed the rest of 1984 as he recuperated, but was back with Tyrrell for 1985. However, his injuries prevented him from left foot braking, something that proved to be a major hindrance in his career. Despite that, Brundle went on to reasonable amounts of success, and though he never won a race, he's widely considered to be one of the best drivers never to do so. Those are the 7 most impressive F1 comebacks that we could think of. Let us know in the comments section if you can think of any others.